Hello, good morning, and welcome to CE2B. My name is Dana Chawangi, and today I'm going to be interviewing Julianna Smith, who is a campaigns coordinator at the Concordia Student Union. We're going to be talking today about the proposed tuition hikes which the province of Quebec has proposed, which will increase tuition for out-of-province students from about $8,000 a year to $17,000 approximately. I'm going to be talking to Juliana today about the efforts that she has been making with other universities in Montreal, such as McGill, and the momentum that they have been working towards to push back on this proposed legislation.
So, Juliana, thank you so much for joining me today to chat about the tuition hikes happening here in Quebec and how that's impacting students and how you at CSU are mobilizing around this issue. I would love to hear a little bit about your role at CSU and what kind of work you do.
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for having me here. I'm super excited to be here talking about this. This is an issue I care a lot about. So at the CSU, I am the campaigns coordinator. So I oversee our campaigns department. I kind of like to describe it as the socio-political center of the student union. So we campaign on a number of issues primarily around social justice topics, but fighting tuition hikes is essentially one of the main reasons why the campaigns department was created. So we possess a lot of institutional knowledge in terms of like the history of the Quebec student movement and looking at what the past tactics that were used to fight tuition hikes were and how they can be reused and how to help students structure their campaigns in order to help them be as successful as possible.
hmm Thank you. Yeah, that sounds really interesting, especially like having that institutional knowledge to lead you in how you're doing that work now. Yeah. I want to ask you, how did you react when you found out about the tuition hikes this year?
Yeah, it was definitely like really poor timing. I mean, it's never going to be good timing when they announce tuition hikes, but we're in the midst of a geopolitical crisis with the conflict, or not conflict, with a war that's going on in Israel and Palestine. And so this news came out just a week later. And so, as someone who is very tuned into social justice affairs, this was just like another blow at the time. Like, we also had like a bunch of anti trans legislation that was going on throughout the country at the time, too. So, it felt like just yet another attack on, an overburdened activist community. Um, it was really frustrating because in past tuition hikes, usually we get some sort of advance notice that this is going to be happening. And the thing that was very different about this proposal is that there was no consultation, there was no advance notice. It surprised the students, it surprised the administration, it surprised the public, which is just deeply frustrating. So it limits our ability to mobilize as well. We don't have that kind of heads up to start getting the ball rolling. Yeah.
hmm And how has that looked ever since you found out, and what has been the efforts kind of to get things going as soon as you found out? What has the timeline been around that work?
Yeah, so we're about a month and a half out from when the announcement came out. So we've been moving very quickly. I think one of the first things we did is starting to build solidarity with the other Anglophone institutions because we'll be the ones that are the most impacted because this hike specifically targets out of province and international students, many of whom, if their first language is not English, it's not French as well. So it really is targeting people that don't have French as a first language is like a common theme throughout all of this. So yeah, we've been building solidarity with McGill, especially. We've found a lot of support from the SMU, and together we worked with bishops on a petition that was launched to the National Assembly. Essentially, this petition was asking for the proposed tuition hikes to be canceled entirely. The petition just closed on Monday, the November 27th. So we ended up getting, I think it was 33,000 350 signatures around there, which is really great. It's actually quite rare for a petition to get that many signatures. We really needed to hit that 30,000 signature mark in order for it to be added as a point of discussion at the National Assembly. Um, so I know there were a number of students who went to the National Assembly on November 28th to speak to the issue, primarily from bishops and a few Francophone associations as well. And so they were able to speak to the issue. Here in Montreal, we've been doing some coalition building with different departmental and faculty associations within Concordia, but also really trying to branch out to include departmental and faculty associations at McGill. We also have some collaborators within Francophone institutions from some CEGEPs, some universities, and the coalition is growing like each and every day. You know, because this is such a short timeline, we've really been like having to move as quickly as possible to like build our numbers and build our strength, because we know that historically what happens is when out of province and international students are targeted first with a tuition hike, they then shortly after come for Quebec residents. So overall, you know, we know this is a fight that will impact all students regardless. So just reaching out and making, you know, those connections has been a huge focus so far, aside from just, you know, raising awareness. A lot of students at Anglophone institutions aren't super tuned into Quebec politics, and so letting them know about this proposal and how it's going to impact them. A lot of the messaging that came out at the beginning really focused on how, you know, current students are going to be exempt, at least for a 5-year period, from paying this tuition increase. But you know, kind of like the hidden text to that is if you switch your program, like say if you change from, you know, a degree in sociology to a degree in journalism, then you have to pay the increase. If you switch from an undergraduate program to a graduate program, then you have to pay the increase. If you take longer than 5 years from now to finish your degree, so especially like part-time students will then have to also pay an increased amount. You know, there's a lot of kind of loopholes to this exception, so students will be impacted whether or not they're actually paying the increased amount. There's also going to be uh, you know, a huge drop of enrollment based on what Concordia is projecting. And so that's going to affect a lot of different organizations within Concordia, aside from just the administration. You know, the fee levies, the clubs, all of these things that make Concordia such a rich and vibrant community are going to be impacted by this drop of enrollment.
Mm-hmm. This sounds like a lot of work that you guys have been doing for the past month and a half. I'm it's amazing. It's really impressive to see all the directions that you've been going at. How have you been managing to do all of these things at once? You're talking about coalition building, raising awareness, working with other faculties in Concordia itself. Like, can you talk a little bit about how you've managed to spread your efforts in that way, and like maybe some of the challenges that you've been facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my capacity, I'm just a staff member. I'm no longer a student. I did go to Concordia and I only graduated in June. So it's a little weird being back in that sense. But, you know, this isn't an effort that's just led by one person. There's so many faces behind this. There's so many people doing work behind the scenes. I think, you know, a lot of people tend to point to the student representatives, say at CSU and ASPA, but there's also a lot of students who don't necessarily hold official positions that are taking action on this. So it's really amazing to see the way that passionate students have stepped up and been like, okay, I can do this. I can take the time out of my day to go from class to class and make announcements in my department. I can take the time of day to sit at a table and talk to fellow students about how these hikes are going to impact them. I can take the time to make materials to further distribute information. So it's been really amazing getting to see a lot of people kind of like dive into organizing for the first time. We have a lot of people who don't have a ton of experience, and I think this is a really great learning opportunity. You know, tuition hikes are something that, you know, everyone can get behind. Even the administration in this case is on our side. So it's a really good opportunity for people to build these skills.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, like a real opportunity for everyone to like come together and be on the same page and push
Mm,
that movement in the same direction. Yeah, absolutely.
exactly. Yeah.
Juliana, you talked earlier about having that institutional knowledge and having the history of tuition hikes and student movements and how that's helped you now and the organization now to organize and build coalitions, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that history and how that has informed you now in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah. So the biggest thing I want to stress to students right now is that the reason why tuition in Quebec is so low in comparison to the rest of North America is because this is a fight that we've consistently fought for the last 70 years. Going back to the 60s, we've had student strikes that have occurred on a regular basis. And we've continued to oppose tuition hikes and fight for more accessible education. And we've consistently won that fight. Um, we have these great posters that we've put up all over campus. And it's kind of like a 7-part series where it spells out strike with 2 exclamation points, and each poster is a letter and talks about a specific student strike and what was successful from it and what they were actually able to yield from that. And I think that's what's most inspiring about this. A lot of the out of province students and international students don't have this specific context, but in Quebec, as student associations, we have a lot of power to be able to organize in a very legitimate fashion. There's this very special act called the Accreditation Act, respecting the financing and accreditation of student unions, which empowers student unions to have a lot of the same or at least similar powers to labor unions. And I think that's what is a very crucial mechanism here in order for us to be able to safeguard, this idea of accessible education. A lot of people have probably been seeing people wearing these felt red squares around campus, and these are a symbol of the student movement. They date back to about 2004, but they were popularized during 2005 and 2012 during student strikes that occurred then. And essentially, it's this idea of like fighting tuition hikes, but also pushing past that and fighting for accessible education, with the end goal being free education, because we believe that education is this social and collective good, and that by investing in education, you know, those students who are educated are able to give so much more back to society. The return of investment is quite amazing for society. Um, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting and like yeah, very keen on seeing those posters that are on campus and like yeah to educate students on what kind of student movements were happening like back from the 60s and how that's impacted now. I think that's a really great point of like the reason that the tuitions are so low here is because of this constant fight and battle that many people might not know about. Yeah, do you find that people have been responding well to that stuff that you've been putting out in terms of the awareness and education that you've been doing around this?
Yeah, I think so. I think most people, when they first heard, there was a tuition hike coming, but don't worry, it's only going to impact new students, they kind of like brushed it off. But when you take the time and think about all the austerity measures that the university is going to have to implement, all of the consequences that it's going to bring to the clubs and fee levies, like, I don't know about you, but I chose to come to Concordia because it has such a rich community. I've never seen this kind of uh, university community that has all of these fee levies, that offer all of these amazing services, these clubs that are so vast and have so many purposes. Um, and I think that's really what makes Concordia such a special place to come and study, because not only are you getting this education, but you're also being immersed in, such a diverse and rich community. And so when you take the time to talk to students about that, and they start to think like, oh yeah, like I don't know, like Figo Val or the People's Potato. I eat there every day. I don't want these services to be hurt. I don't want to not be able to access them in the future. That's when people start to really put the dots together. Um, Concordia, unfortunately, hasn't come out and given us a concrete list of how, the or the decline of enrollment is going to directly impact Concordia. I think they're still working on this list, but McGill has put out a list where they've had to say, like, this program's going to be cut, this program's going to become severely defunded, like we're going to have to fire 600 to 700 staff. And these sorts of things will be quite similar at Concordia. Like, if you look at the fine arts program, for example, like the percentage of out of province students there is very high. And when we're looking at doubling tuition, of course, there's going to be a drop of enrollment because that's going to make that education far more inaccessible to a lot of students. And so people are going to either stay in their home provinces or find somewhere cheaper to go to school, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, programs like that are going to lose a lot of funding. All of the student associations rely on enrollment in order to function. And because so many of them are nonprofit organizations, they don't have funding reserves that they can dip into. This is going to cause like a crisis within the university. From what I'm told, the administration is scrambling, and they're scrambling very quickly right now to try to figure out what they're going to do. We can already hear whispers of austerity in the ways that they're like putting hiring freeze. Well, the hiring freeze has been in place for a while, but they're cutting classes. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. If you didn't have 80% of students registered for classes for the winter semester, they were planning on canceling them in several departments. We're going to see things like larger class sizes, less TAs and RAs for students to access, less direct connections to support your education. So even if you're not paying more directly, you're still going to be, paying more for less services that you're going to end up receiving in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can very clearly see how all of these things that you just mentioned can severely impact that culture that you've been saying that Concordia has and that people come to for that, especially when it comes to things like student associations and, yeah, the fact that they are nonprofits and a lot of people that are a part of those are doing it in their own free time, and won't have access to things like that anymore. What do you think the administration has been like pushing towards now in terms of scrambling um, to prepare for this?
Hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing they've been looking at is, you know, maybe I'll take a step back. The way the university operates is on a growth mindset. Currently the university has announced that they have a $70 million deficit, and the only way to make up for that deficit is more enrollment, more students coming. But now that we have this proposed tuition hike, unfortunately, that won't be the case. Concordia usually has a steady increase in their enrollment numbers, but for the first time, we're going to see a drop. And so that deficit will only get larger, and the university will have to find other ways to make up that loss of funding. Um, one of the speculations that's out there is international student tuition is unregulated. So they can increase that tuition as much as they want. The government is actually encouraging the administration to encourage international student to increase international student tuition in order to make up for the loss of funding. And so what's going to happen is that international students are going to become like these cash cows for the university. They already are. That's how the university makes up so much of their funding, but that's only going to get worse, which to me is just a horrible way to proceed about things. We don't want to make education inaccessible for anyone whatsoever, and it only further, you know, reinforces, these lines of marginalization that happen during immigration processes.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the university scrambling, you know, we can see the ways that they're trying to work with the government. This whole proposal to include more resources within the university to help Anglophone students learn French and all of these sorts of things. They're trying to meet the government's demands, but that proposal was rejected within 12 hours. We know that this issue isn't about the French language at the end of the day. It really is about, trying to squash any sort of dissent to the CAC government.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that and your thoughts on it?
Yeah, for sure. So ever since the CAC has come into power, they do have a majority within the government, and so they've had this ability to push bills through extremely quickly, despite the resistance that comes, and a lot of that resistance is rooted in Montreal, because that's the one area that the CAC couldn't kind of get their claws into. It's been the one stronghold against them. But we've seen things like Bill 21, Bill 96, now Bill 31, and now this tuition increase. All of these sorts of things have a very similar sentiment to them where they're saying, we do not like a certain type of people and we do not believe that they belong in Quebec. It's extremely xenophobic, it's anti immigrant. And I think on the surface, you know, these things may seem like they're happening in a vacuum, but personally, I believe that they're all interconnected and it's pushing forward this larger, xenophobic agenda that is trying to exclude certain people from Quebec culture. They use Anglophones as an excuse to say we don't want Anglophones taking away from Quebecois culture and the French language. We want to save that heritage, but they're not taking into account like when they're targeting international students, they're not targeting international students from France and Belgium who pay the same tuition as Quebec residents because of the agreement that their government has with our government. They're targeting international students uh, largely from the global south. They don't take into account, all of the students from African countries who were formerly colonized by France, who French is one of their first languages. They don't get that exemption. So why should the white European international students, get this sort of deal?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know if that was
Yeah.
cohesive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that was super interesting. Yeah, thank you for going into that. And like, of course, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's not like the exception is within the language. It's like within regions, and the way they're doing it it doesn't really make sense. It's very hypocritical in that way. I want to talk a little bit about the solidarity that you've been building with other universities and the coalition building that's been happening within your organization as well. How has that helped in the last month and a half, and how has that been useful in pushing this movement further, and what has that looked like on a larger scale?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the coalition building right now is crucial in order to move this movement forward. Um, Historically, it is the francophone institutions that are the most mobilized when it comes to any sort of social action. They have a culture within their institutions of being able to use the mechanisms of general assemblies and going on strike to achieve their demands in a very efficient manner. Whereas in the anglophone institutions, because we have more students who aren't as familiar with that context, and it isn't as much of our culture to do that. We have to go through this whole phase of like educating people and then teaching them how to use the tools and then going from there. And so having the support of francophone associations really is invaluable because they are the leaders of the student movement in Quebec. Like in 2012, they were predominantly like the associations that were on strike. A lot of there were several associations from Concordia that eventually joined, but we were kind of like working alongside them and kind of were like we were a bit late to the game in the sense where they've been going on strike since the 60s, and it wasn't until like the mid 2000s that we really started implementing the same structures as well.
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, I think this is because this is a fight that we can all be brought on board of, like everyone can get on the same page with this sort of thing. It's really important to just have as many people as involved. So that's why this coalition of sorts has been forming. There isn't really like a formalized association or anything like that. It really is like a needs-based coalition that is kind of just been being used to make decisions in terms of actions of like how we're going to proceed moving forward. So, the first step was the petition. Then we had a protest on October 30th. Then all of November, we've been mobilizing departmental associations. We're going to have um, 4 departmental associations who are on strike tomorrow on November 30th. And then we're going to have the large demo. And then moving forward, the departmental associations that voted to go on strike on November 30th will be going on strike again in the winter semester from January 31st to February 2nd, and will hopefully be joined by even more departmental associations. So, we're quickly building up momentum, but I think this coalition is really invaluable right now because it helps us to kind of all orient our actions so that we're doing things in a coordinated manner,
Mm-hmm.
because our power lies in our solidarity. We need those numbers in order to be able to push this movement forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for other students and community members that are wanting to get involved and see this happening, what do you think would be the most helpful thing for them to do in this moment?
Yeah, for students, I think the biggest thing that you can do is start paying attention to your departmental or faculty associations. So if you're an arts and science student, every department has a departmental association. If you're not an arts and science student, your faculty associations are a great point of contact, because these are kind of the structures that already have the existing power to create change and to advocate for students. There's going to be a lot of general assemblies happening in the new year. And so it's really crucial that people take the time out of their day to go to those general assemblies. Whether or not you want to go on strike, this is your opportunity to advocate for what you believe in. I think what's crucial to this movement is direct democracy and having everyone be able to have the opportunity to have a say. Going on strike when it's uh, an association that has just barely reached quorum and it's kind of like everyone in the room is friends is all fine and dandy, but you need to be able to reach the rest of your department and make sure that everyone is on the page, because you don't want people to cross a picket line.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to create a bunch of scabs because people don't know what's going on. We want people to be in support, because I think at the end of the day, when you take the time to speak to people about this, they will be in support once they
Mm-hmm.
understand the implications. Aside from that, for people who want to directly get involved in mobilizing, um, we have kind of like a Google form of sorts that people can fill out, regardless of what their institution is or if they're just a community member.
Mm-hmm.
We have a great QR code that's been shared around. I can send you maybe a link to our link tree that is where the QR goes to.
Mm-hmm.
And that link tree is regularly updated. Like right now, it has all of the information about the protest that's happening tomorrow. And it has our outreach kit with all our posters and flyers if people want to go and make classroom announcements. It has some talking points for that, all that sort of stuff. But it also has that form that people can fill out to get involved, and then from there, someone will get in contact with you and we'll kind of take you through the process of what onboarding looks like and talk to you about what your skills are and how you can get involved, because we want this to be like a really positive experience. Aside from doing like hard, important work, it's also a great way to build community with fellow students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Um, I guess one last thing I wanted to ask you about, Juliana, is this sort of a big picture question, but I'm wondering how you think um, this can affect Quebec's economy on a larger scale in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. Um, to my surprise, one of the very first people to come out and to denounce the proposed tuition hike was the business sector, because there was this public outcry of the way that this will hurt Quebec's economy. I was reading an article last night where McGill did some running of the numbers, and they said that out of province students bring in approximately $80 million of revenue into the province every year. Um, and so, if we're going to see a drop of enrollment, we're going to see a decrease in the revenue within the economy. I certainly am not an economist. I'm just a community organizer, so it's not my area of expertise, but I think it makes a lot of sense. A lot of the downtown core relies on, you know, the stimulation of students coming in and spending money in order for like a lot of local businesses to be able to thrive. Um, so I think it definitely will be hurt. And in the long run, we're going to see less people immigrating into Quebec and joining the workforce here. That's going to be a huge thing as well. There's already a labor shortage. And so to see less people immigrating into the province and making their homes here is also going to have a lasting effect for years to come. You know, uh, yeah, it really is going to issue out, this domino effect. First, we're going to feel it within the universities, but then the rest of the province is going to feel it as well.
Mm-hmm. And what are your hopes with in the next like couple of weeks, next couple of months, and how you're putting pressure on the government with the organizing, with the mobilizing that's being done? How do you hope that the government will react to this?
Yeah, I think we've been kind of embracing this idea of a diversity of tactics. So we've been very supportive of the administration, in their conversations that they've been having with the government, because I think that's a great tactic to implement. But then we've also been like really embracing the organizational power that comes from students mobilizing together and creating, these demonstrations that have mass numbers. I think in the weeks to come, I really want to see more students like having these conversations and like thinking about the after effects, because right now we've been operating on a very, very short timeline. A lot of people like to point to 2012 as the height of the Quebec student movement, but what a lot of people don't realize is that they had advance notice about those tuition increases. They had about 2 years notice. So, they were building these coalitions, or actually the coalitions already existed through SA. Um, but so we've had to like kind of do the kind of work that was spread out over 2 years in a month and a half, because we don't know when this proposed tuition increase will go through. There's no timeline as to when that could happen, but we do know that the CAC has a tendency to push these things through very quickly. With um, Bill 31 with the Session des Bails, they've just announced that their intention is to push that through before Christmas. So they've only had a number of months. So that's kind of the timeline that we're operating on here. It's not to say that even if the proposed tuition increases, if they go through, we can't reverse them. That's something that's been done before as well. But the hope is for them to never be implemented in the first place, because we're going to have new students coming into the universities in just a few months. And so we want to make sure that, their ability to access these institutions that we know and love is still accessible.
Mm-hmm. Great. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't bring up or talk about?
Um, I don't think so. I think we covered everything. I would just add that, like, if people want to get involved or have specific questions about the mobilization that's going on, specifically from the CSU side, they can always email the campaigns department. Our email is just campaigns@csu.qc.ca.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Juliana, for joining me to talk about this really important thing that's happening right now in the province and for students at Concordia and McGill and other universities here. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.